Prior to opening his own firm in 2000, David served as managing director at Public Strategies, Inc., an Austin-based public affairs firm. He was also a partner in Bayless, Bolin, Bates, and Madigan Incorporated, a DC-based consulting firm. In these capacities, David represented Fortune 500 companies, advising them on strategic planning issues, international trade, and U.S. legislative and regulatory matters. David served in the White House as an assistant to President George H.W. Bush and secretary to the cabinet, coordinating the activities and policies of the cabinet departments in the White House. David also served in then Vice President Bush's office as deputy to the chief of staff. During the first term of the Reagan administration, David served as an official of the U.S. Department of the Treasury, first as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Regulatory, Tariff, and Trade Enforcement, and later as Deputy Treasurer of the United States. At Treasury, he received the Meritorious Service Award. David is a native of Houston, Texas, graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in History from the University of Texas at Austin and a Juris Doctor from the University of Houston Law Center. He currently serves as a member and past chairman of the Advisory Council of the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library Foundation, and as a board member and past president of the Admiral Nimitz Foundation in Fredericksburg, Texas. In addition, he is an adjunct professor at University of the Incarnate Word, a fellow to the British American Project, a former board member of the Student Loan Marketing Association, and a former member of the Liberal Arts Advisory Council at the University of Texas. He also served as a member of the transition team of former Governor Perry in 2000-2001, and as a senior advisor to the transition team of former Governor Jeb Bush in 98-99. David and his wife Anne reside in San Antonio and are the parents of 3 children. And perhaps most importantly, David was a student at Williston for 9th to 12th grade. In his senior year, he was co-captain of the squash team, captain of the tennis team, which was undefeated. He also served as member of the student council and was vice president of the council or the entire student body in his senior year. So setting out on this path from the beginning. And with that, David, I will turn this over to you, and we look forward to hearing your story.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Jill, for that nice introduction, and it's a pleasure to be on with everyone. I have great memories of Williston. I made a lot of great friends, quite a few of whom are on the call tonight. And I got a very good education. When I think back on my time in academia, I feel like I studied in high school and I studied in law school. College, I can't remember studying that much in college, but I attribute the fact that I got through it in decent shape to the good education I got at Williston. So I'm very thankful for that. How I got started with President Bush was just really a stroke of good luck. I had graduated from law school in around mid-May of 1978 and was getting ready to start taking the bar review course and take the bar in late July and go to work for a law firm in around the beginning of September, a law firm in Houston. And I happened to run into then private citizen George H.W. Bush on Memorial Day. And I had known him as the father of a friend. Jeb Bush was a friend of mine growing up in Houston. We had played tennis and baseball together. And so I knew him, and we were playing tennis at the same club, not together, but I happened to run into him, and we had a nice visit, and he asked me what I was doing, and I told him, and he said, well, look, instead of going to work for that law firm on September 1st, why don't you, I'm looking for somebody to travel with me. I have a political action committee. I'm going to be speaking for a lot of candidates in the midterm elections of 1978, a lot of senatorial, gubernatorial, and congressional candidates. And the executive director of my political action committee, Karl Rove, a guy named Karl Rove, wants to spend and needs to spend more time in the office. And he had been traveling with me, would you consider that? And of course, I was absolutely thrilled. And I was married, but we didn't have kids. My wife was working. She said, great. The law firm said, great. We'll see you in mid-November. And So I started to work for him as his personal aide, and we traveled nonstop in that fall in 1978 with his speaking on behalf of candidates, Republican candidates. The Political Action Committee rented a King Air turboprop, but we flew everywhere. What does a personal aide do? Of course, that was so long ago. There was no internet. There were no cell phones. So, but kind of what you would expect a personal aide to do. It was just the two of us, but I would try to keep him on schedule, make sure he had any note cards for his remarks or speech text, and help him remember whom he should acknowledge and thank, and then after the events, try to help him with his thank yous, who he wanted to thank. He wrote so many handwritten thank you notes to people, but there were also people at these events that were drivers and things that he couldn't thank everybody with a handwritten note. So I would make sure that the office had letters typed up for those people, and he could sign them when he returned. Also he was gonna, depending on what kind of reaction he got on the campaign trail, and he had told me this, if he received a lot of encouragement, he was thinking about running for president. And he was getting a lot of encouragement, and a lot of people, so many people, when we were in that fall of '78, would come up and say, "Look, if he runs, I would really like to help him." So, anyway, I had names and addresses. I can remember each day at the end of the day in a hotel room or on the airplane, just unloading my pockets of business cards and addresses and notes and anyway, and try to make sense of it all. But anyway, about mid to late October, I realized that he was going to run for president based on all the encouragement he had received and some conversations he was having with friends. And I asked him if I could keep working for him, and thankfully he agreed. He said yes, and so that ended up. So I stayed on in that capacity. On January 1st of '79, he became a legal candidate. He filed papers to become a legal candidate for president, and then still it was just pretty much the two of us, just traveled all over the country now on behalf of his campaign. And with mostly commercial. We spent a lot of time in New Hampshire and Iowa, and some other early primary states. Around early fall, mid-fall of '79, we started getting press that wanted to travel with us, and a lot of press at some of our events. And so a press secretary started traveling with us, maybe another aide. And then on January 1st of '80, the campaign chartered a jet, and we got Secret Service protections. And then we had probably 6 or 7 aides that were traveling with us. So it was kind of interesting to see the progression from just the two of us to a full-scale campaign. The field in 1980 was a very strong Republican field, and for the '80 primary. You had Ronald Reagan running, who came very close to beating Gerald Ford, the sitting president, in 1976. It went all the way to the convention. Baker, who was Senate Minority Leader, he beat Bob Dole, who was senior senator from Kansas, who had also been the VP nominee. He was running. John Connally, who had been governor of Texas, Secretary of the Treasury, was running. A couple strong congressmen from Illinois, Phil Crane and John Anderson. So it was a tough field, and early on, people really didn't give President Bush much of a chance. But he won the Iowa caucus, the first event in an upset over Reagan in 1980, and it really kind of thrust him to the head of the pack. Shortly thereafter was the Puerto Rican primary, which he also won. Then we went to New Hampshire, and Reagan came back strong and won the New Hampshire primary, but President Bush finished a strong second with about 28% of the vote. And the next week was the Massachusetts and Vermont primaries. President Bush won the Massachusetts primary, Reagan won the Vermont primary. But it was close between President Bush and Reagan. And really after that after that Massachusetts, Vermont, that primary the following week after New Hampshire, the field really, it really thinned out to where it was just a two-man race between Reagan and President Bush. And President Bush would go on to win some big primary states. He won and some important states. He won Pennsylvania and Michigan, of course, always swing states, and he won Connecticut, which back then was a swing state. He came very close to winning Texas against Reagan. But Reagan was just but he was a very strong candidate. He was particularly strong in the West and the Rocky Mountain states, which were mostly caucus states. He had a terrific organization and ran up huge delegate margins. And probably about mid-May, President Bush won the Michigan primary, which was a big accomplishment. But the same day, I think Reagan won the Oregon caucus or primary. I can't remember if it's a caucus or primary, but the networks projected that had put Reagan over the top in the number of delegates. So within a week, President Bush pulled out of the race. Reagan was the virtual nominee at that point. I stayed on working for he pulled out right at that Memorial Day weekend of 80. He pulled out, but I stayed on working for him. It's some administratively winding down the campaign. Worked out of Kennebunkport in June and the first part of July, and then the convention in 1980 the Republican convention was in Detroit, and we went to the convention. We went to the convention, and Reagan had not chosen a vice president, which was probably the last time in history that there'll ever be a convention where the president has not chosen a running mate. And not only had he not chosen one, but it was not clear, who. There weren't any very strong rumors one way or the other. We who supported President Bush, his all his friends and former supporters, we kind of thought President Bush was the logical choice because he had President Bush had been director of the CIA. He'd been our ambassador to China. He'd been to the UN. Had shown strength in some important Rust Belt states, swing states. And Reagan had strength as a governor in domestic policy. So they really were a good complement. On the other hand, we had heard rumors that Nancy Reagan was not at all pleased with, it thought President Bush had stayed in the race too long. And she was also, we heard, not happy in the run up to the Pennsylvania primary. I think President Bush had referred to President Reagan's economic plank at one point as voodoo economics, and which is really quite mild by today's standards, campaign standards. But we had heard she took a lot of offense to that. So anyway, we just weren't sure. We went to the convention, and even on the Wednesday of the convention was 4 days, Monday through Thursday. And on the Wednesday of the convention, President Bush is supposed to speak Wednesday night by virtue of his showing during the primaries. But still by Wednesday, no choice by Reagan on who's going to be his VP nominee. So I remember we had a lunch that day and then another meeting afterwards. And then President Bush wanted to get a jog. We went to some athletic club and jogged, and then came back to our hotel to change to get ready go to the convention center where he was going to give a speech. And I remember we got out of the elevator on our floor, and in the foyer was a TV was on, and Walter Cronkite was on, and he was talking about that the Ford people and Gerald Ford people and Ronald Reagan people were in serious discussions for Ford to be Reagan's VP nominee. And we were it was just to hit us out of the blue. I mean, we were just taken aback. I mean, here a sitting former president who's going to be vice president, going to be a VP nominee to be a vice president. It was so unusual and so unexpected. We were stunned. And but as we got ready at the hotel to go over there was more and more talk about how the discussions were very, very serious and far along. And anyway, we went to the convention center, and I remember President Bush was going up to speak, and kind of in this area before this, for the chute to the podium, and Jim Wooten from ABC News was there, and President Bush said, "What's the latest on Reagan and Ford?" And Jim Wooten said, "It's a done deal. Their Secret Service agents are coming over to the hall, and they're going to make a joint appearance later tonight." And President Bush kind of shrugged his shoulders and went up and gave a short and sweet speech, kind of typical of him. It was nothing about himself. It was all about Ronald Reagan and how he'd be a great president, and how the party, needed to get behind him. And we got through, and we didn't have Secret Service protection then. And he said, "Well, let's just walk back to the hotel." So we walked back, and when we got to the hotel, he said, "Y'all go get some beer, and let's just have a few beers in the room." And, it was kind of a end of the road, kind of a wake. And so we did. We had a couple beers, and it broke up. And I remember I was staying with Jeb in the room next door to the suite. And about 20 minutes after things broke up, we were getting ready to turn in and knock on the door. And Mrs. Bush said, "Jeb, come in. David, you too, President, your dad's got something to say to you." And so we went in there, and he said, "Ronald Reagan just called me. He asked me to be the VP nominee." And about 30 seconds later, a Secret Service agent walked in. It was Bill Livingood, who we'd known because he was head of the Houston office for the Secret Service. And he walked in and said, "Mr. Ambassador Bush, I'm going to be your head of the vice presidential nominee detail." And so the next morning, the Reagans and the Bushes were to get together for breakfast at Reagan's hotel. It was a different hotel. And I remember in the car going over to the hotel. President and Mrs. Bush were about as nervous as I've ever seen them, because they didn't know the Reagans, and President Bush had just met Ronald Reagan a couple of times, and they had heard as I said, they had heard that Nancy Reagan maybe didn't want him on the ticket, and so they were really quite nervous. But I remember we got to the suite, and Ronald Reagan opened the door, and he had his arms wide open, a big smile on his face, and I could immediately tell that the Bushes just relaxed, and they went in. The four of them just had breakfast alone. But afterwards, Reagan and Presidents Reagan and Bush had a joint press conference, and kind of announced the ticket. And they went down, and I remember we went down in a service elevator down to the lower level where the press conference was going to be, and it was Reagan's aide and myself and a couple of service agents. And I think President Bush said something, was talking to President Reagan, and kind of said something like, "Gosh, I wish I'd have worn blue today, or gray, or I could have matched up better," or something like that. And Reagan, who loved to tell jokes, kind of laughed. And he said, "Well, that reminds me of the joke." And he told a funny joke, and that President Bush, of course, broke out laughing about. And to this day, I wonder if Reagan, being a former actor, if it was an old Hollywood, if he knew his supporting actor needed to loosen up a little bit, that it was a good time to tell a joke. But anyway, they both did very well in the press conference. Shortly thereafter, we were off to China and Japan to kind of showcase the foreign policy credentials of the ticket. The VP nominee Bush was, and then the campaign, and we had our own plane and own schedule for the campaign, and it was a very close election right up until the very end. Another kind of anomaly that came. There was one debate, and it was 9 days before the election, which is just kind of extraordinary. It was so close to the general election, the one debate. And it was not, I don't think Reagan, it wasn't that Reagan kind of clearly bested President Carter. I think it was more of a case that the country may have been ready for a change, but we also had some doubts about whether Reagan was credible as a president, or was up to being president, or was presidential. And And obviously he passed that test in the debate because really the last week and the last 4 or 5 days, the numbers, all the undecided just really broke Reagan's way. And that's that. I can remember the Sunday before the Tuesday election, we campaigned in Pennsylvania, and we spent the night in D.C. and then we flew from D.C. to meet Reagan in Peoria, Illinois. Reagan was coming from somewhere else in the country and for a midday rally in Peoria. And Jim Baker, who had been our campaign manager in the primary, the 1980 Bush for President primary, but in the general election of 80, he'd been a senior advisor traveled on the Reagan campaign, but he was in DC that weekend and flew with us on our airplane, and he had the latest numbers from Reagan's pollster, Dick Werthland, and we were shocked by how good they were. The numbers that last weekend just really, really broke Reagan's way. But anyway, we flew and met Reagan in Peoria, Illinois for a big outdoor rally downtown in a square, and it was huge. And then we flew off to Houston, and Reagan flew off to LA, and the election was the next day. And after the election, I don't know, for some reason, I just had a sense that he was going to be vice president for 8 years, and then he was going to run for president and be elected. Don't ask me why I thought that. Maybe the confidence of youth, I guess. But anyway, I really kind of wanted to try and maybe use my law degree a little bit and get a little more substance so anyway, I worked at Commerce and Treasury in the international trade area, and then I practiced law actually for the Houston law firm in their Washington office for about a year and a half, the one I was going to go to work for way back in '78. And then in March of '86, the then Vice President Bush and his chief of staff called me and asked me if I would come be deputy to the chief of staff, the deputy to the chief of staff, and I yes, and that ended up being almost 3 years in that position in the VP's office, and I was kind of a jack of all trades in that. I did various. I helped the chief of staff with any duties he had for domestic travel. When he didn't travel, I traveled with the president. I was the liaison in the office between the Political Action Committee, which President Bush had in the midterms of '86, then Vice President Bush had in the midterm election of '86, and then in January of '81 he filed papers to become a legal candidate for president in '88. So we had a campaign in '87 and '88. I was kind of the liaison in the office between the vice president's office and the campaign. Make sure that the left hand knew what the right hand was doing, make sure we didn't spend federal funds on campaign events and vice versa. And I was also in the vice president's office. I was the only Texan in the office. And of course, Vice President Bush was from Texas and had been in business in Texas and had friends and supporters there. I was also the only person who'd been on the presidential campaign in '80. So I spent an awful lot of time just taking calls from people around the country and returning calls for him. You get a lot of advice when you work in the White House. I can from all around the country from people, but that's part of the job to be expected. A lot of it is. And some of it was quite good. But anyway, that was kind of those were kind of my duties. And then he was, as we know, elected president. It was pretty much, it was a feat to be elected. Not a sitting vice president had not been elected president since Martin Van Buren in 1836. And some vice presidents, some good vice presidential candidates who'd run for president as sitting vice presidents in popular administrations. For instance, Dick Nixon in '60 and sitting vice president in the Eisenhower administration. He lost to Kennedy. Gore, at the end of the Clinton administration, ran for president. He lost to George W. Bush. So it was a feat, and but he did win, and I became secretary of the cabinet, and to be the liaison between the cabinet and to be the liaison between the cabinet and the White House, and that was a great job. I loved doing it. I would have liked to have done it for 4 years, but after having been in the White House for 3 years in the VP's office, I kind of ran out of gas after a couple of years. But it was a great job. President Bush had been a cabinet member in the Nixon and Ford administrations, and at times he felt a little out of the loop, and he wanted to make sure that his cabinet did not feel that way, and really stressed to me that I wanted to feel part of the team, and we usually had a full cabinet meeting once a month. He tried to have every month have a one-on-one lunch with a cabinet member that I would attend and the chief of staff would attend. He had the cabinet to Camp David for a really fun day of activities during the day, tennis or skeet shooting or bowling or swimming, or and then at night a nice dinner at Camp David. He had the cabinet to dinner in the Rose Garden one beautiful May evening. He really kept him a part of the team. One thing I started in the is cabinet secretary, which I think they continue to today, was doing a cabinet report. When I'd been at Treasury, Don Reagan, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, had been CEO at Merrill Lynch. He asked his assistant secretaries every week to send him a short brief on what they were going to be doing the next week, any major speeches they were going to give, or if they were going to have any congressional testimony, or if there were any regulations that were going to be proposed within their area of jurisdiction. And I remember in my job at Treasury, for my assistant secretary, I kind of oversaw the regulatory functions of customs and alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, and in the Office of Foreign Assets Control. And so I would ask them to compile our reports. I would ask them for reports, and I learned a lot that I probably wouldn't have learned otherwise that was happening at customs and alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. And I just thought it was a very good management tool for me. And then I'm sure Don Reagan, it was a good management tool for him when he got the reports of all his assistant secretaries. And so I started that for asking our cabinet departments to give similar type of reports, and my staff did a great job in getting those reports on Thursday evening and putting together a kind of a summarizing those to get to the president on Friday evening, and he would read them without fail on Saturday mornings. And if he ever didn't get them, if there ever was a hitch, if he was at Camp David and somehow didn't get out there, he'd call me first thing Saturday morning and say, "Was there a report this week? And where's my, but I think it really helped him to always be quite conversant on what was going on in his administration. Other duties, typical duties of a cabinet secretary, it was just, I can remember taking a lot of calls from, for instance, the Secretary of Energy and the head of the EPA, who one would call me and complain about the other, although they were both friends. But the Secretary of Energy would call and say, the EPA director's up there and he's testifying. He's saying this, that, and the other, and it's not administration. We hadn't decided that yet. It's not administration policy. And anyway, but I had a lot of little kind of intramural things like that I'd have to deal with. And also worked with the policy director and with the Economic Policy Council and Domestic Policy Council, which formulated decisions for the president and formulated administrative positions. And I mentioned that we had cabinet meetings once a month, full cabinet meetings. the Economic Policy Council and Domestic Policy Council, both of those had about half the cabinet on each one of those, and those were more where the decisions were the option papers were developed and decisions prepared for the president in those bodies. The full cabinet meetings were more informational. You would have things like if the president returned from a G7 meeting, he'd brief the cabinet on his talks. If the OMB director would brief the cabinet on the budget formulation process for the administration. If the Council on Economic Advisors was getting ready to release their annual economic report, that the Council on the head of the CEA would brief on that. I remember Sam Skinner, the Secretary of Transportation, briefing the cabinet on the Exxon Valdez cleanup. I remember one time asking the president, telling him that he ought to recommending that he just brief the cabinet on the administration's position on Tiananmen Square, and he kind of looked at me a little grumpily and kind of said, "Well, why do we want to do that?" I mean, the NSC's handled that, and the NSC, the National Security Council, had developed what the response was going to be, what sanctions there were going to be, and I just told him, but look, I just explained to him, and that, for instance, if Jack Kemp, who's the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, if he's in Dubuque, Iowa, giving there for a housing event, and to give a housing speech in an event there, he's going to be asked by all the local press about everything having to do with the administration, including the Tiananmen Square, and so it's just good for them to know, what the president is saying about it, what the press secretary is saying about it, so they can be on the same page and not say something inadvertently that it's at cross purposes with the administration. And he said, he said, "Yep, that's right. You're right." So, so that was that. I loved that job, as I said, but I kind of ran out of gas. My wife ran out of patience, and we at that point we had 3 young kids, and so I went and was in the private sector in a consulting firm in DC for a couple of years, and then when Jim Baker, as Secretary of State, went back to be Chief of Staff in the White House about the last 3 months of the last 3 months of September, October, November of 1992, I went back to the White House and traveled with the president in the '92 campaign, which we were behind from start to finish, and it was. And the country was ready for a change, and the press was ready for a change, and so it was a bit of a desultory affair, but I'm still glad that I was back there at the end, and he came up short, but on the other hand, I think if he had won re-election, it's possible his sons may never have run for governor of Texas or Florida. So things have a funny way of working out. But that was kind of my end in any kind of official capacity for him. I stayed in touch with him living in San Antonio. He, of course, moved back to Houston. I tried to get over there and see him as much as I could, to get over there for lunch at least every couple of months. As Jill mentioned, I was on a library advisory council and am on a library advisory council, and would see him in connection with that. We'd have at least one meeting in Maine in the summer, and a meeting in College Station, where his library is, in the winter. And Ann and I were fortunate to have lunch with him probably about 5 weeks before he passed away. But what kind of a man was he? You couldn't have picked a better boss to work for. He was a very he just a warm-hearted, kind, generous, very fair man. Had a great sense of humor, incredible amount of energy and stamina. Worked his tail off. He was in the Oval Office every day for probably about 6:45, um, and was led by example. He was. He was not a screamer, not a pounder of the table. But he engendered great loyalty. You wanted to please him. You wanted to work hard for him, and he was a very ethical, extremely ethical man. Just a tremendous man to work for. He always thinking of the other person. And a clear example of that was when the Berlin Wall fell, and which was, gosh, uh, December of December of 80, December of 89. But the a lot of members of Congress of both parties, a lot of the press were like, "You got to go, you've got to go, you got to go to the wall, you got to go to the wall and give a major speech and celebrate this historic occasion." And even some people, some people, probably some people on his staff were recommending the same thing. But he said, absolutely not. I'm not gonna do that. Reagan is, I mean, excuse me, my phone. He said Gorbachev is in an extremely precarious situation. This has been it's a major setback, a major embarrassment to the Soviet Union. The wall coming down, and these satellite countries becoming free countries, and the military so far is staying in their barracks. And last thing I need to do is go over there and dance on the wall and run the risk of the military uprising in the Soviet Union. And that's the kind of person he was. He was thinking of Gorbachev and what Gorbachev was going through, and he was thinking of the country, that maybe it was politically expedient for me to go over there, and might, but it was best for the country, that and best for the world, not for me to go over there, and for me to and for me to not to carry on about it. One last point. I mean, just in terms of what's best for the country, he one thing that really hurt him in the '92 election was the 1990 budget agreement. And there were the income tax was hiked from 28% to 31. The top rate was hiked from 28 to 31. On the other hand, there was very meaningful deficit reduction that took place with that, along with that budget agreement, that really helped lead the way to the balance of the late '90s and early 2000s. And but he knew it was going to cost him, and he, in his diary, he remarked that that he knew it was going to cost him, and he nevertheless he agreed to the deal, and it was best for the country, and but it cost him politically, but he did what he thought was right for the country. So that was the kind of man he was. But anyway, I hope I didn't give too much, go into too much detail, but I'm happy to take any questions anybody has.
I think that's perfect. So what we're going to do here is we're all going to come back together on Zoom. So if we're watching, you might want to go up and check your view and turn it to gallery view. So we're back together and you can see
Sure.
everyone who's on the call, and that's that
Sure.
little icon up in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You can click on that and go to gallery view so you can see those folks who are here who have their video on. And we do have some questions that came in advance, so we're going to start with those. But just a reminder that if you do have a question, you want to ask a question, just put into the chat, "I have a question." I have a lot of questions, but they're mostly about what's it like at the compound in Kennebunkport? And can you tell me what Camp David looks like on the inside? So we're gonna save the, like, home decorating questions
Okay.
for second, and we will let people ask the more important, historical and political questions, but, I think I saw Ed Wadsworth on here, and Ed, I know you had a question that you had submitted early, so if you want to unmute and, check in with David. I don't know which of your 2 questions is more important to you, the one about tennis or the one about Cheney? So,
Well, I don't know, David. Hey, David. I don't know.
Go ahead.
I don't know
Eric,
if you read either of the questions, but yeah, the most important question is your backhand still as strong as it was 40 years ago? That's the most important question. But also, I was curious, in all seriousness, about how perhaps President Bush's relationship with Cheney had changed over his presidency, given the challenges that they had um, internationally and so forth. But more importantly, comment on your tennis. Hopefully, you're still playing.
well, you're kind on. I think your memory is might be playing tricks on you, but my um, I really I kept playing tennis really up until the last few years, and I need a new right knee. About the last few years, I've just been walking and riding a bike for exercise, but I think this summer I'm going to get a new right knee. So I'm hoping that'll get me back on the tennis court. But Dick on Dick Cheney, he was Secretary of Defense in President Bush's cabinet, and President Bush had an extremely strong national security team with Jim Baker at Department of State and Brent Scowcroft as national security advisor, and Colin Powell was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It was just extremely strong team. And Cheney worked great in that team. As we all know, Cheney became vice president to his son, George W. Bush, and President Bush was quoted in John Meacham's biography of President Bush is making some comment about Cheney in his time as vice president for his son being, something like being too much of an iron ass or something, something to that, something like that. And of course, that got some play, as you would expect from the press. But President Bush didn't deny it, and but he didn't deny it. But he went on to say some very nice things about Dick Cheney, and they ended up, he had an occasion to be together, and everything was fine. But the Iraq the Iraq War in the Iraq War in the George W. Bush's administration. That was kind of difficult for some of the players involved in President Bush's team. I know Brent Scowcroft, who actually in George W. Bush's administration, he was a member of the president's intelligence advisory board, its advisory position. But when it looked like the administration was going to invade Iraq, I mean, Brent Scowcroft really started getting quite exercised, and I think he was trying internally to try and wave him off of it, and but really to no avail. And he eventually wrote an editorial in the Washington Post, which for Brent Scowcroft is really, I mean, that's he's a very understated, reserved man, and so that was, but he felt that strongly about not going in. I mean, he warned that it was that a civil war would likely ensue. Now President Bush never said anything publicly about Iraq War, and I'm not sure to this day whether he he was never gonna. He never would pick up the phone to call any sitting president, including his son, to give him advice. If they wanted to call him, he would give them the confidential advice, but he would not pick up the phone to call any of his successors, including his son, to give him advice. But I have a feeling that Brent Scowcroft wouldn't have written that editorial in the Washington Post if he didn't, if he felt like he and President Bush were their thinking on foreign policy, and Jim Baker too. I mean, it was just so similar. They actually wrote a book together about Brent Scowcroft and President Bush wrote a book together about the administration's foreign policy. So anyway, I'm giving you a long answer, but I hope that's helpful.
All right, thank you. So we've got a question here from Jess, who's having some microphone challenges. So I'm going to ask it on her behalf. I'm assuming Jess is a she, but honestly, I don't know. Jess may be a he. So on their behalf, Jess is finishing a book on political brand names. And so did you ever hear President Bush discuss the value of the Bush name to either to himself or to his sons?
No, he's a very modest man. I mean, he's just a very modest man. And at post presidency, on his advisory council, we'd meet with him, and he'd get mad when somebody said legacy. He didn't like it, any kind of legacy building. You know, he said, look, the historians will take care of that. I'm not going to get out there and toot my own horn. And that just wasn't him. That just wasn't him.
Okay. So, we had another.
But I do know he cared. He cared greatly for. I mean, he was for his sons and their elections, and just I think he worried. I think he worried more about their elections than he did his own, and he worried more and let the criticism of them get to him more than he did the criticism of him when he was president. I mean, he really did. It bothered him more when he'd hear his sons being criticized than when he was criticized.
Okay, thank you. So, Jess, was that good? You can shoot me a message if you have any follow up to that, if your microphone's still not working.
Jill, one thing I neglected to mention, if I could quickly mention it on back to the cabinet secretary days, I just wanted to say that TV show Lone Survivor is on the level, that there is a lone survivor for the State of the Union address. And for a couple of years, I had to, I did it, of course, in consultation with the chief of staff, but I would have to call the cabinet secretary who was going to be the lone survivor and say, you know, we need you need to sit out, not be part of the cabinet in the Capitol tonight at the State of the Union. And I can remember the first year, I think it was the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Ed Derwinski, I had to call, but it wasn't all bad duty for them. The Air Force flew them, at that time, they flew them to the Greenbrier in West Virginia. And there was a Cold War bomb shelter underneath the Greenbrier, and they would go in there, and they would take him in there, and he'd have a nice dinner and watch the State of the Union. And then as soon as I'm back with you. I don't know where I dropped off, and
you still having utility problems in Texas, David?
I didn't think any longer, but all of a sudden my screen froze up. So I don't know where I was.
We were actually just moving on to another question, so it worked out perfectly.
So I finished my lone survivor story.
Well, we were at the Greenbrier having dinner in the bunker.
Yeah, and then Yeah, so that was the end of the story. When the president got back to the White House, they left the bunker and and the Air Force flew him back to Washington.
So a similar question, I guess. We have one more here, but I'll jump in asking about sort of being so close to events like that. What are your recollections of the day that Reagan was shot?
Well, I was not with working for the vice president at that point. That was
Right.
81. So I was at the Department of Commerce, and it was just a day, I think a day kind of similar to the day Kennedy was shot. Everybody was just in a state of shock. I mean, fortunately, it was not fatal, but it was just everybody was just kind of in a state of shock. But he, again, kind of typical of him, he was in Dallas or Fort Worth for an event. He flew back to,
Plagued by technical difficulties. The one thing I am going.
Great to see
hello,
you.
Neville. How are you doing, Neville?
Fine, and thank you for making my haircut look good, David. David was in Washington. He was very nice to me as a fellow graduate from Williston. He invited me to dinner at his house many times. He and Annie were very cordial, and he took me over to the White House a few times. But the reason I'm passing this along is I was a special agent with the Immigration Service, and my life existed with much of doing things like going out and answering people who were complaining about this alien or that alien, and it was pretty street level work. And I got a phone call from a place called the White House one day in my office, and it was David's secretary, and she said, "This is the White House calling. Neville, David Bates would like to speak with you." And I said, "I don't get too many calls from the White House in this position, but okay, we'll see what David wants." And David said to me, "Neville," he says, I have to have somebody call you and talk to you for a few minutes. He has a little bit of a problem and he'd like to get some advice." And I said, "Who's that, David?" And he said, "It's Roger Staubach." And I said, "Another individual I just reach out and talk to every day." So I got a call from Roger Staubach, and I don't know whether I helped him or not, but I wanted to pass along to you, David, that it didn't work. My best friend is still the center of the Washington football team. I am not a Dallas Cowboys fan, although I do appreciate your referral of Roger Staubach, and I remember that day as if it was yesterday. So I see you're doing well, and thanks very much for wonderful presentation this evening, and maybe we'll catch up later on.
Well, thank you very much, Neville, and great to see you. Actually, Roger Staubach's actually his daughter too. His daughter was a White House intern in Cabinet Affairs when I was there, and she was a terrific worker and a terrific person. But anyway, great to see you, Neville. If I could just, I will quickly my story about, but when the day the President Reagan was shot, but the Marine helicopter wanted to take to the south to take him to the White House South Lawn and land there where the president lands and takes off from. And being vice president, he said, "No, I don't feel comfortable as vice president landing on the South Lawn where the president normally lands. I don't like that's not a good symbol. I'll land at the Naval Observatory and drive over there." So I mean, that's just kind of typical of him. He didn't
So we have another question that came in, and this one is sort of, I think, speaks to your whole career in government and all of the different positions you've held. But this person's asking, how has your perception of the federal government changed over the past 40 years?
Well, Washington was not nearly as contentious and as and partisan as it when I was there. I don't. I just think it's off. I'm just kind of concerned that both sides fight with each other too much, and as opposed to trying to work on things that are best for the American people, and that's kind of a main concern. I don't and I don't really know. I think there are probably quite a few reasons for it. And that's probably a long conversation. I do know that President Bush's generation, so many of the men served together in World War II, and so they had, they had all fought for kind of a larger, for a larger cause, and and a lot of his good friends, when he was a member of the House of Representatives from 67 to 71, and he made a lot of his really good friends that he made were Democrats. Sonny Montgomery in Mississippi. Gosh, we're having a senior moment, but a congressman from Ohio, Democratic congressman from Ohio, was one of his, was a Yale classmate and World War II veteran, and was just one of his really, really close friends. He was a very close friend with Danny Rostenkowski, who was chairman of who was on Ways and Means Committee with him. And I remember I remember him calling Danny Rostenkowski when he was convicted, when he was first, to just tell him, how very sorry he was. But I think, it just didn't seem to it. And I wish we could get back to those days. So that's my one, and that's my one observation.
All right. So Jess is back and has his video working and hopefully his audio, because he has a follow-up question to his question about the Bush brand. So Jess, you can unmute.
Sure.
All right. So I unmuted. Can you hear me?
I can, Jess. Yes.
Progress. Okay. All right. So David, my thought is that one of the comments that was made about both President Bushes is that they were born on third base and thought they hit a triple kind of thing, and George Bush because his George H.W. because his dad Press was an influential senator, and obviously George W. for the same reason, and that's one of the many issues that I'm dealing with in this book. My background in 2 seconds or less is that I'm a trademark lawyer by profession. And I've written a lot comparing political brands, including the recently departed president, and the whole brand name concept and name recognition, and how it's similar to a product brand, how it's dissimilar to a product brand. But the Bush family is obviously the sort of the late 20th century successor in a sorts to the Kennedy dynasty, and then going all back to the Adamses. And there's hundreds of political families in the United States when you look closely. But anyway, with that long-winded introduction, is there any? I'm just wondering if President Bush had any ever said anything or indicated anything about his background, his growing up in a political family, a political atmosphere, and even in terms of the connections which he may have made or had coming into office or helping him get into office.
Yeah, well, yes. And I mean, he was a very grateful man, grateful about, I'm very grateful for his family, his parents, grateful about the country which he was, born. He was grateful for the people that worked for him, supported him. I mean, he had a grateful spirit. He didn't, he was not, a one to give, I don't think he spent a lot of time kind of in introspection about how I got from here to there, and I don't think he really did. He very action oriented. As I mentioned, he worked like he was an incredibly hard worker. He just he didn't dwell on that a lot. He really didn't.
Right.
Although he was an extremely grateful man, and no doubt he got acquired a love of politics, a love of government from watching his father. I have no doubt about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting just in a lot of the research that I've done over the years.
Yeah.
There's a lot to that, and it makes sense, is what you learn from your family. And if you're exposed to that sort of thing, and especially for his sons throughout their whole life, and those are the contacts you make, and you learn literally as a 6-year-old at the dining room table, listening to other world leaders and diplomats, you get a sense and a feel that other people can't get. So on the one hand, there's the name recognition, but on the other hand, it's just like training, like professional athletes, and their kids hang around other professional athletes and have access to something that other people just can't. It's not just the name recognition issue. You're sort of really invested in the whole political, or whatever the field is, the whole background that you can't get. Hey, can I ask you one question that's unrelated to this? Just picking up on the other comments. I was just interested that when you said President Bush, Vice President at the time, deferred landing on the lawn in the spot that was customarily for the President of the United States. Did you ever hear any sense in any of your travels on the famous Al Haig, I'm in charge here, that happened at the same time?
Well, yeah, that got a lot of discussion in a lot of quarters. That got a lot of discussion in a lot of quarters. Yeah.
All right, with that diplomatic answer, conscious that will be recorded, we'll move on to another question, which takes, and being conscious of time too, I'd just like to, if anyone has any other questions, now's the time to get them in the chat. We probably have time for about 2 more. This one's coming to you from the UK, and it's a foreign policy question. So Richard, if you want to go ahead and unmute, do you want to ask your question?
Okay. How effective do you think President Bush was in dealing with foreign leaders? And did he promote this so-called special relationship with the UK, which comes and goes as the decades move on?
Yes, I think he was extremely effective. As vice president, he traveled a great deal, and so he got to know a lot of world leaders. He had a very good relationship with Margaret Thatcher. But as I said, he had known a lot of, having been our ambassador to the UN, and then as vice president, for 8 years he did a lot of just a great deal of foreign travel and meeting with foreign leaders. He he spent a lot of time in Europe, like for instance, going from capital to capital, convincing the Europeans to take intermediate range missiles, which to counteract what the Soviet Union was doing, which really resulted in the START Treaty, but by getting on an equal footing led to an arms treaty. But he had a great relationship to him, and when he first became president, he made a point of calling leaders to reconnect with all of them as president, without an agenda, just to visit with them and see what was on their mind, and see if there was anything that he could do to be of assistance to them. So at crunch time, he was able to go back and ask them for a commitment. And for instance, in the first Gulf War, truly remarkable that the kind of coalition that he and Jim Baker put together, that included China and the Soviet Union and every other Arab country, and the darn thing was paid for by contributions from other countries around the world. Really remarkable. I think of German reunification, because of World War I and World War II. Mitterrand and Thatcher were, among other countries in Europe, were concerned about German reunification. I mean, this was after the wall fell, but they were concerned about German reunification in light of the history. And but President Bush was convinced that German reunification was absolutely the right thing to do for Europe, and the right thing to do for the world, and ended up, because of his good relationships with Mitterrand and with Thatcher, bringing them around to being in support of it. So anyway, he was and he had a very good relationship with John Majors after Margaret Thatcher. So he felt very strongly about the special relationship between the UK and America.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Okay, we're gonna continue around the globe here, and I think this will probably be our last question, being conscious of the time. So Brian is on here somewhere. Brian, if you want to unmute and ask your question. I see you, Brian. I see your name. If you want, are you there still, Brian? Brian typed one in. I'm not seeing him unmute, so I'll ask on his behalf. So Brian's question is, what's your impression of how or whether Bush was comfortable with the roles and actions of Rumsfeld, Rice, and Cheney that played out in the Middle East?
Well, as I mentioned, that's a tough one. There was, as I mentioned, Brent Scowcroft did feel, he felt very strongly and wrote that editorial in the Washington Post, strongly advising against the invasion of Iraq. And President Bush never said anything about it, and wouldn't. And so, I can't. And we did talk. But anyway, that's a. I can't really say, he never said any, he never said anything about it, but he and Brent Scowcroft were, thought very much alike. So.
All right. but seriously, if we can take it lighter for a moment and you can tell me just a little bit about the compound in Kennebunkport, which I've looked at so many times from across the water. My big question is, when you're there staying there, do you have your own guest quarters? It's like a big, huge place. It looks like it has a nice family aspect to it. What's it like to stay there?
Well, it's a beautiful place. It was a very big house, and it was great to stay there. It was great to stay there. He loved Maine. I mean, happiest place that I saw him was in Maine, where where he'd go every summer as a kid. That place at the Point was his great uncle's, and he ended up acquiring it from his great uncle's estate, but it's a beautiful spot, and he loved Maine, had a lot of world leaders to Maine, and was able to stay in the house there, and it's great. And Camp David is I can tell you too, is just a beautiful retreat. It's a beautiful place. And I think Jimmy Carter was wanted to had talked about getting rid of it before, during the transition, and somebody was able to talk him into not doing anything till he went there one time. And I think after 2 or 3 months in the White House, he went to Camp David one time, and he went, yeah, this is a place where a president needs to get away and get away to get out of the vortex for a couple of days. And
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's highly unlikely that I will ever actually get to visit either of those places, so I appreciate you satisfying my curiosity.
You bet. You bet.
So I think with that, David, we're going to thank you for your time tonight, for sharing your experiences and your perspective, for answering our questions, and for giving us so much of your time. We're really grateful. This has been a great opportunity to hear firsthand from someone who sat through some important historical moments, and I'm glad that you were able to join us tonight.
Well, my pleasure, and great seeing a lot of old friends here.